Thanks for coming. Thanks for taking the time. Obviously, for many of you, if you're here, it's important. And I like that you appreciate that the issues of addiction are important. My name is Joel Jakubowski. I'm the Chief Program Officer of the Potter's House. I'll give you a brief little infomercial about the Potter's House here in a little bit. Tonight's subject, as it says, is enabling versus supporting. And so this is a very touchy topic because sometimes it's hard to tell the difference when we're dealing with an addicted loved one. Is the activity that I'm doing, is it helping to inspire them to come out of the addiction, or is it ultimately really actually keeping them in the throes of addiction? And so in the nature of addiction, there's really no scenarios that I've ever worked in to where we don't identify that there's some level of enabling happening, and then that even goes into the role of playing the role of an enabler. And as we go through this, we'll talk a little bit about the difference between being an enabler and just having enabling behaviors. There's a little bit of a difference there. But again, let me just tell you about the Potter's House. If you are a staff member for the Potter's House, would you raise your hand? You got a lot of the team here tonight. So these are the people you could go to at our break when we take a break, after the seminar. There's folks here that represent our women's program and our men's program. So depending on maybe the person that maybe you're dealing with or that you have in mind, this might be a reference point for you. Obviously, the Potter's House and the Potter's House of Ruth are two programs that certainly address addiction. Long-term residential faith-based. Let me say that again. Long-term residential faith-based has the highest level of success known to humanity. Here's the interesting part. Faith-based, but yet proven governmentally through governmental studies that it has the highest success rate. They won't give us any money, but they give us great stats. Bad combination. And so, interestingly, so that's a very high level of care in terms of success, and we might even go as far as to say it's the highest level of care. And that's what the Potter's House and House of Ruth represent. So we're unique in our model in a couple ways. Quickly, I'll go through this before we start. We're long-term, meaning that we have phases, and the way the phases work is you're not just in one setting for the duration, and our durations vary between 9 months to 1 year, but we set it up in phases of degrees of development and autonomy and independence to get a person reacclimated back into larger society as a healthy, productive, and we'd like to believe transformed, because we're faith-based, a model of living. And so one of the things that makes us unique is in the midst of our program as a student, you have opportunities for employment at different rates for each program. And so you can start creating a strategic budget for your life and how to become a better money manager. And in the throes of addiction, money becomes one of our biggest challenges because money is not money. It's really just tickets for drugs, depending on the number on there is the size of the pile you get. It has no real value in itself. It's just redeemable for drug use. And so so it becomes a place of worship. People in addiction are not chasing drugs and alcohol. Once you have the resources and the money, the drugs and alcohol come and find you. So what we chase is the money, and we chase the resources, and it becomes the object of our worship more than even the drugs do, in the inception of getting to the drugs. It's the vehicle to get it. So our program is very focused on financial management as well, so that becomes a very big part of individual care of management through the program, through our financial director. The other thing that makes us unique is we only house 7 individuals per house, because we want to be able to create high lines of rapport. We don't want to warehouse people, and then people start becoming numbers, and we start putting them on checklists. We want to have personal relationships with the students in our program, and we want them to know us. It's through those relationships that really makes the idea of walking into sobriety and walking into Christendom attainable and desirable. You have to hear it through one-on-one interactions and experiences. That's a real game changer for a program like ours, to limit ourselves in each house to about 7 people. Some houses have 8. And then another thing that makes us unique as well is we have a very dynamic family program where once a month we invite families and we help to groom them, which is in large part some of the basis for doing a community awareness event, is to make appeal to the individuals that are not actually experiencing the addiction, but are experiencing an addicted loved one. And those can be different scenarios and different lenses. And so we want to educate families, and tonight we want to educate you, if you're experiencing an addicted loved one, on how to best manage that. And that's what that program does, because we have an obligation also to the families. And the reason we're here tonight is because we believe we have an obligation to the community. And so those are just a few things that make us unique. We have trauma-informed healing programs in our program that are represented specifically through different trained professionals to do that. And we just finished up a series of training recently, so that's another thing that makes us very special. Brochures are in the back. You can learn a lot just through conversation in the back. There's opportunities to come alongside of us and partner with us by way of support and economics. We would certainly appreciate that. Volunteerism, there's lots of opportunities. And the last thing I want to mention is what we're going to train tonight comes directly out of the book that I've written for this purpose. It's called We Didn't Raise Them This Way, which is often the cry of parents dealing with addicted loved ones. And this book walks you backstage to the life of a person who came through 20 years of addiction and went into a faith-based program and allowed Christ to come into my life and change my life and get to a place beyond sobriety, but actually a place of freedom. Imagine that. And so that's really what we're looking for, is we're looking for transformation and freedom. And sobriety is a wonderful first step, and you're going to need it. And so this book is written for you as a family member. It's also good for people that went through addiction to identify the behaviors that we lived out and give some basic and understanding why. Because it's not a bad person thing, right? Addiction has a three-pack grip on a human being because we're holistic by nature, as we're emotional, we're intellectual, and we're physical. So there's a spiritual oppression that we believe comes over folks in addiction, loss of hope and faith and desire for anything greater than the length of my arm. And then there's also emotional bankruptcy, because when we're in addiction all day long, we're operating outside of our own value system. Can you imagine? Well, imagine for a moment. Spend the next 2 weeks and live completely out of your own value system. Know it's wrong, but do it anyway. Right? That's a tough way to live. So that creates a lot of emotional bankruptcy and spiritual oppression. And then the third dynamic that we have to keep in mind is, because it is a chemical and it comes into a very natural thing called our brains, this little gel pack left to itself is not divine. And so it can be impacted. So a third element of addiction is neurobiological impairment. And so we believe, though, from a faith-based lens, we go top down. We present it first from a spiritual perspective to bring the remedy to the other perspectives, to the other holistic domains. And guess who else agrees? Governmentally proven. Statistics, government, studies, there's no argument against it, that top-down approach through a spiritual lens, specifically a biblical spiritual lens, creates an enormous change in freedom. And so addiction is a variety of things. So this book was written to help family members to really learn how to start navigating it. It says, educating, equipping, and empowering families to manage drug-addicted behavior. If you're a savvy reader, by the end of this book, what you'll see, what I wrote to, was not that you try to manage the behavior of your addicted loved one. I'm asking you to learn how to manage your behavior. As you learn to manage your behavior, as I educate and empower you, you'll find efficiency and effectiveness on how to deal with an addicted loved one. And I take you backstage in the mind and heart of an addicted person. A large part of my addiction was taking up residency in a crack house. And so there's a lot of learning that comes through despair. So we leave the pain and we extract the lesson. We leave the pain and we take the lesson. And so that's what you'll find. So this training comes out of that book. It's available in the back. I asked for $10. It helps to support my travels. I'll travel wherever you want me to come to educate families, churches, wherever. I've set up in living rooms and had block parties around a training. And so let me know how I can help you. My card's in the back. 2 other books I want to bring your attention to by the same author, also a staff member. Rob, if you could raise your hand. Rob has been touched by the Lord to really start digging in deeper in terms of his own testimony, which is in large part some of the inception of a portion of our program. Our phase 1 is birthed from a vision from Rob and our board coming together in 2 different places, getting this vision, bringing the vision together and creating something very dynamic. And so this is his testimony as a man who had a vision from a prison cell and is now sitting with the king as an inheritance of heaven. And so the other book that Rob has written is on spiritual warfare, because there's a large component in spirituality that gets lost. And we start to maybe kind of see it as too fantastical or not something that has a high press in our life. We try to do things very much mechanically in our own effort. This is a book learning how to be empowered through the Holy Spirit to take back the attempts of spiritual warfare, to take away what the Lord's trying to do in our lives. And Rob also does this through his own experiences in the book. And so I would encourage you to consider those books, and they'll be in the back as well, very inspiring. And there's as a believer currently, you'd be interested in kind of getting some tactical advice for warfare. So that will be the infomercial. So we're going to go about 45 minutes. We're going to take a break for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to release you to get some snacks, breathe a little bit, maybe talk a little bit. There'll be some folks at the table. And then we'll come back and we'll do about another half hour or so. And then we'll open it up for about 15 minutes for any questions and answers, Q&A. If you find that you are maybe a little reserved in presenting your question publicly, again, the table's available and you can just approach us privately. So let's get into it. Again, thanks for being here, and I'm looking forward to see what the Lord will do through this training. Okay, Bob, if you'll get us to slide number 2. This is really where it begins, right? So it's an interesting thing. So the most common response to an addicted loved one is that we tend to enable, we try to fix it. So what is enabling is defined as an action that someone takes to protect the person with the problem from the consequences of their actions, their addiction, the behavior. It's also anything that stands in the way of a person's experiencing the natural consequences of their own behavior. And so the concept that we're working with here is that pain motivates change. So I'm not saying that in terms of just addiction. I want you to evaluate your entire life. I would promise you, if I can have a half hour with you, some of the most profound decisions you made in your life were birthed out of adversity. Matter of fact, guess what else is birthed out of adversity if you're a believer? Worship. There's no need to reach for something if you have it all in yourself, and if there's no pain or discomfort. We wouldn't reach for anything. There's a part of a deficit that's in us and a need for more, and it's often birthed out of adversity or longing or needing, which we believe the Lord plants in our heart. We also understand that adversity has the power to bring us to higher levels of development. It's not designed to just get us to break even and muscle through it. The adversity principle, which is in my book, talks how we come from the underground of the adversity to the level ground of learning, knowledge, maybe even transformation, to be released to a higher ground of learning and development. And so what happens here with enabling is that we take away the motivator that inspires the desire for change. And so there's some very creative ways to do that where it doesn't have to be very caustic. That's also in my book. But sometimes there's a degree of release, and we'll talk more about that. And so let's go back to the beginning though. Look at where I wrote the word overprotective. Isn't that interesting? You know, because that would be another word for enabling. So when someone says to you as a parent, or you've heard it said, hey, you're overprotective, is that a compliment? No. They're telling you that there's an error in your parenting. You protect people too much. Well, that sounds ridiculous. What a superhero protects people, right? So it's an interesting thing that somebody would say to you, you're protecting them too much. And so we have to find the balance with that. So what it's saying is when someone says to you, you're being overprotective, they're saying, yes, there is a time to keep people from an unnecessary level of discomfort. But on the other hand, there's a time to allow individuals to experience the natural discomforts that create and inspire growth and development. Who here had to struggle with the first sleepover with their kid? Good Lord, you wanted to pull up the Minnie Mouse bag yourself and sit with them, right? And have a sleepover with them. Why can't I just go? The parents be a little odd with that, somebody else's house, why are you sleeping with them? But how about getting on the bus the first day of school? Didn't you want to ride to school with them, sit in the little tiny chair with them? Right? Come on, man, watching that school bus go away is brutal. And so, but we realize the reason we have a degree of reservation with that is because we recognize that what's going to happen is they're going to have experiences outside of my protection. Oh, I'm the protector, right? And unfortunately, that's just not a very healthy perspective for living. It isn't. In the theory of attachment with a loved one, we have to be able to allow our newborn child to start learning that you can have a healthy level of exploration and you can have a healthy level of receipt. And that's positive and secure attachment. Sometimes we inhibit the degree of exploration and it creates what's called anxious attachment, where everything becomes fearful and we become very mistrusting and it comes into our intimate relationships. Then there's something called God attachment that fixes all of that, but that's a whole other thing. And so what we see is pain motivates change. We're not strangers to that. We believe it for the gymnasium. Why don't we believe it spiritually and emotionally? Right? There is an expression that says no pain, no gain, right? That applies. That applies to all aspects of who we are. There is a degree of adversity that has to happen that we explore through the dynamics and complexities of everyday living, which is another word for other humans, that has to be navigated. And it's not always easy because it's not predictable and consistent. We really find ourselves in the throes of other people's behavior and hope for the best. Well, the great development happens through that, which is, if you're a believer, your Bible is explaining that from the front cover to the back cover, that this whole thing is about relationships and personal development through it. It's an entire book of it. And so hard reality breaks through the denial and delusion. So sometimes when we allow our loved ones to experience some of the consequences of their choice making, it causes them to break through things like minimizing stuff, justifying stuff. These are things that fall into the characteristics of denial. At least I'm not as bad as so-and-so. And it starts to cut through the fat of that denial. And we're going to talk more about denial as we move on, because the people in denial are not just the addicted loved one. And so we rescue our loved one from painful consequences of irresponsible decisions. We often block or slow down the motivation to change. Chuck Swindoll, a Christian and young men's counselor and just development person, said, pain plants the flag of reality in the fortress of a rebel heart, a person that's going the wrong way. So with that intro, I want to say this, and I want to give you a disclaimer. As we go through this, if you're a person that has experienced addiction, you're going to see a lot of maybe you in this scenario, and you'll probably be able to identify the people that you felt maybe enabled you and may have prolonged your addiction because they just didn't know any better, and that's what we're going to talk about. Or you might identify as a loved one of an addicted person. As I'm going through this, you might feel scolded a bit. Don't do that. Because you might say, oh crap, I did that, right? And so here's what I want you to do. Do you remember from ages K through 12 learning how to deal with an addicted loved one? Yeah, me neither. You know how you learn it? On-the-job training with no preparation. You know how many do good at it? Nobody. No one. It's too bizarre. It makes no sense. Why do you keep doing that stuff? Can't you see all the pain? They go, and the answer is even lousy. It becomes this abnormal condition that's very hard to navigate. For a long time, you're walking together with your loved one, and we're all holding the flag of the family, and we're all in agreement. We're all in agreement about what our values of our home are, the direction we're going. No more in agreement than any other kind of nutty family. We're all a little nutty, you know that. But as far as you're able to work out your nuttiness, it's not super bizarre, it's just a little nutty. And so your loved one gets to carry the flag, and you're all walking in the same direction. Then one day your loved one's walking the flag and turns around, comes out front, starts hitting everybody with the family flag. What are you doing? Right? That's not easy to do. That's why I wrote a book, right? That's not easy to deal with. And so it feels like betrayal. It feels confusing. It feels oppressive. It feels like you're bound and stuck. But here's the beauty of it. While you might be experiencing a person with addiction or have been through that process, what your statistics on the news will never tell you, what they tell you is the terrifically bad things about addiction, but what they're not telling you, that I can tell you is in this room right now, is that people are getting well for the first time and then forever, and are never going to return to being an addicted family or being an addicted person. Right now, if we could hear it popping all over the nation, we hear boop, 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 all over the world, boop, 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 people getting well, families, parents, never going to return to an addicted family. Because they're going to learn and learn and learn and start getting the education, the empowerment. My preference would be in doing it through a faith lens and finding a place of freedom to be able to feel empowered to come through addiction, but also to have learned from it, to come out the same way as the addicted loved one, to a higher level of learning. Because guess who else experiences the adversity of addiction? Not just the addicted person, anyone who loves them or is near them, right? And so you also are experiencing adversity. Well, so we're going to follow the adversity principle. That means that there's a plan for development for you, independent of the addicted loved one. Imagine that. No matter if they change or don't change or do change or don't change, you still can. And you can have an independent level of wellness regardless of whatever decisions they make. I'm telling you that's a reality. I would ask you to read of that, learn of that, believe for that. And when you do that, you'll no longer be bound by the addiction, and you will be more effective in it because you're free of it. And we'll talk more about that. Next slide, please, Bob. Types of enabling, right? These will not be uncommon if you've had these experiences. For me as a person in recovery, I like to say in long-term renewal, because the Bible says that We are to be transformed by the renewing of our mind, right? So renewing means ongoing. So whether I came through addiction or not, I'm supposed to be in a process of renewal, right? For the rest of my life. So I'd like to have a person long-term renewal. And so what we see here is that there's a variety of things that will look familiar to you, either as a person who came through addiction, as maybe a participant in these things, or maybe for you as a family that's experienced some of these decisions. So making excuses, right? It's just a phase. We want to believe that it will come to an end. And then, of course, rescuing, taking away the consequence. And that's the issue here that we're talking about, is what these things do is these do one of two things. They don't address it for what it is, and by not addressing it for what it is, we're actually providing the relief from it, the very thing that might be inspiring the change. And so what ends up happening is that, and we're going to get into in a minute, is that we start all slipping into a place of denial, and we're providing the way out of the decision. I said to some of the brothers today, the treatment program started out of mental institutions for alcoholism primarily. Those started in the 1800s, but then it started to morph into the idea of we need to start looking at this differently. It's a unique set of quote-unquote mental illness. And so about the 30s, we started to have rehab centers being built for alcoholism, and then it went into all kinds of other drugs that came onto the scene. But since that time, the only people that ever attend those programs are people that came to the realization they can no longer separate the high from the consequences. If they could still separate the consequences from the high, they'd still be getting high. Let me frame this even greater for you. If drinking and drugging had no consequences, legally, physically, emotionally, we'd all be high right now. You know why? Because it feels really good. It's trying to kill you, and that's the consequence, and that's why we don't do it. The President of the United States would be addressing the nation, swaying and hiccuping. It's because it has consequences. Everything that feels good for us for a moment can be the demise of us in another moment. And so there's an old expression that says, first the man takes the drink, and then the drink takes him. And so what happens in this scenario is that what has to occur in the life of the addicted person, even if it comes by their own reasoning or external consequences, something has to inspire them to believe that I cannot continue this way without a degree of consequences that I need to get free of. I can no longer operate in the consequences. This is why enabling becomes counterproductive, because we're taking away the primary thing that helps the person to make the decision for going in. And now we're not the only one responsible for that. There's all kinds of lovely other ways that we inspire folks to get help. Legal systems, doctors that tell you if you don't stop drinking in a week, you're done, right? Spouses saying they're rolling out, right? That's an unavoidable consequence. What do I need to do? Go to rehab. Right? And so rationalizing, at least we're not as bad as so-and-so, avoiding it, if I ignore it, it'll go away. A big one is covering, calling employers and saying, oh yeah, my son is sick. And they maybe are sick, but they're sick from drug withdrawal. Or they're not even home and you haven't seen them in 3 days. And so parents in their minds start saying things like, well, the last thing that needs to happen now is they lose their job. And I would say to you, no, that might be a great thing. It might be a consequence that inspires change. You know, I do interventions. I'm a professional interventionist, and I get the honor to be with families all over this country. And it's an amazing process of learning the nuances of each of their conditions, because while addiction is universal, the nuances are different. Addiction's addiction, but the way families are trying to navigate it is an amazing thing. And I've had families that came to the realization that what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to call his PO officer and tell him that he violated, because it will be better for him or her to have a criminal record than a funeral record. We have to do what we need to do to get people inspired, and we don't need them to agree. So if you're drowning in quicksand and you say to me, you can grab everything but my right arm, I might try, but if that wears out, guess what I'm grabbing? I'm grabbing your right arm. I'm going to grab your eyelids and your eyebrows. I don't need your agreement. Because all I know how to do is preserve life. Because that's how I'm wired, which is the same way you're wired. We're wired to preserve life and to maintain and support it. We don't embrace death unless we found ourselves in a caustic place up here. But that's not our design. Our design is to embrace life. Even at funerals, they call it celebrations of life. Only people talking about the death are people in the bathroom trying to get caught up on what happened. Then they come out and watch videos of the life, right? We don't know how to embrace death, and we shouldn't. And so learning to understand these principles is what kind of keeps us motivated towards understanding what I'm going to need to do. And what I might have to start operating in is not the feelings of love. Maybe what I'm being called to is the duty of love. This is what sustains marriages. When Angie and I are arguing, guess what feeling is not in the room? Love. It's nowhere to be found. The feeling? It's not there. The duty and the commitment of love is what keeps us together, and I'd like to attribute that to Jesus. He's the one that keeps us, to be quite honest with you, because we're committed to something larger than ourselves. And we have trials, and the first 3 years of our marriage was a wrestling ring. 2 adults with all kinds of history and baggage. My goodness, we're going on 13 years now. But we had a commitment to get through the wrestling. And it's amazing the breakthroughs that happen with that level of commitment. But it was a commitment of love based on duty, not based on feelings. And that's what we as parents have to understanding. When you spank your child, my hope is that you don't enjoy that emotionally, but you understand that this is, or you correct them or take something away from them. That shouldn't feel good. But it's not based on feelings. You're saying that I believe that creating this consequence will act as an act of inspiration in their life to not repeat this. Now, I'd like to believe that you also understand the principle that all of that should be happening with the combination of positive and negative reinforcement. That's what creates the best parenting. It has to be a blend of the two. That also applies to addiction, by the way, too. They start making good decisions, you reward the heck out of them. Start hugging their neck, throw them a party, right? Because this expression of we shouldn't reward people for doing the right thing, if you're a Christian, you're not going to find that in the Bible. God is constantly saying, I reward people for doing the right thing. So why are we not doing that? Let's look at denial. Next slide, please, Bob. Look at this. Denial is a false system of beliefs that are not based on reality, which leads to a self-protecting behavior that keeps us from honestly facing the truth. So no one wants to believe bad things about themselves. Somebody comes up to you and says, hey, Joe, listen, I really love you and you're a really good guy, but, sometimes you're like really selfish. That doesn't feel good. You don't want to believe that. You don't say, well, I want to thank you. Let's share that experience. Please, tell me more. It's very helpful. Your first thing is to become defensive, and you want to point at them and say, what about you? Are you mad at me? We don't receive that well because our brain is not wired to believe bad things about itself. Thank you, Jesus. The other thing that happens, though, is that families don't want to believe bad things about their loved ones. And so they also slip into denial. So the symptoms of denial and the symptoms of drug use look the same for both people, the degrees in which we become exhausted. They're identical. Everybody's breaking down in the same way. Your loved one can't hold a job, and you're on your job fatigued, ready to walk out. Your loved one's getting no sleep, and neither are you, because you wonder why they're not getting any sleep. Or am I going to get a phone call? The breakdown is almost identical. In fact, it's so identical that you know who calls our programs? Not the person in addiction. That's rare. It's representatives of the person because the family experiences the breakdown first before the loved one. The reason the family breaks down first before the loved one won't be a strange concept to you. Because see, in my addiction, no matter how miserable it is, every once in a while, or pretty often, I get to go away from it into la la land and then come back and revisit it. And families don't. Families just stay in the mess. That's why you're making the phone call. There's no escape. There's no relief valve. And that's why families are the most important aspect to motivating a person to change. There's no higher statistic or model than families, parents, loved ones who come into a position of alignment and say, we are going to put up a resistance to this addiction and we're going to motivate our loved one for change. There's nothing more powerful than family intervention that we know of in this life. Much more powerful than the judge who tells you you're going to jail for 10 years. Much more powerful than the doctor who tells you you'll be dead in a week. You'll find creative ways to work around it. There's no intimate obligation to those people. You're going to see them for 10 minutes and you can just avoid them. Out of sight, out of mind. If I get caught in this town again, I'm getting 10 years. Guess what I'm going to do tomorrow? Move. I'll go do it in that town. Right? And everywhere I go, I keep showing up. All 2 of me. So the concept of denial is not specific to addiction. It's specific to humanity. And so Aesop, this fabulist from probably now, a couple thousand years ago, he wrote this story called The Fox and the Grapes, and it's a study on denial, and it's just so appropriate. What it is, and maybe some of you know it, it's the story of a fox who's going through the woods, he's hungry, And he finds himself at a place where he's desperate. He looks up, and much to his delight, there's a vine of grapes going on the top across this tree line, out of his reach. And so he tries to figure out all kinds of creative ways to do it. He gets to the log over there with his hiney and all kinds of stuff, trying to get up, but he can't get it. And so there's no one to help him. So now how on earth is he possibly going to reconcile this? There they are, and he can't have them. You can't just walk away. The only way you can walk away is the way he did. Those grapes are sour anyway. Listen to the lies we have to tell ourselves to get to a place of acceptance. Don't you find that remarkable? He wrote that thousands of years ago for humanity. We all do it, by the way. That's why he wrote it. It's true to humans. And so maybe you're already thinking about the nuanced ways that you found your way out of things by just kind of justifying it out. Instead of just coming to a place of acceptance and saying, listen, it's a real bummer. In this moment of my life, unfortunately, I'm experiencing a disappointment. The reality is I can't reach those. I'm going to have to keep moving forward and hope for another opportunity. That's healthy living. And so this is a major part of addiction, and for both the family and the addicted loved ones, we got to get free of denial. So the characteristics of the enabler. And so I want to separate out here real quick the difference between an enabler and enabling. So I do an intervention with a family, and we identify the aspects where there's been enabling, where people are rescuing people from natural consequences, giving people money, rides, bailing them out of jail, calling their employers. It's all the same, every family. And so we find that the older brother is enabling, which means that he is providing money for his younger brother, because he's saying the same thing. Worst that could happen now is he loses his job, and maybe he's even trying to protect the family and the image of the family. There's all kinds of roles in here that we play. And so he's enabling. In other words, he does not see his behavior as an identification of his role to his brother. The enabler, which in most cases is a parent or a grandparent, is a person who identifies that activity as being a role that they have in the family, that they feel they've spent years earning, the matriarch or the patriarch. Because you see, there's been 100 examples in their life where they have been the rescue for people in healthy ways. Hey, you had an electrical fire, man, in your house, no fault of your own. Move in. I don't care how uncomfortable you get in. You lost somebody, you had scammed it, we were a victim of fraud, you lost your money, no fault of your own. We finally get to a place in life where we have enough money to say, listen, I'll help you pay a bill. That feels good. And it's a part of growing old is knowing that we have ourselves in a place of support for those under our care when you think of it patriarchally or matriarchally. And so then the interventionist comes along and says, yeah, that's all fine and well, but what you're doing here doesn't work, stop doing it. Who will I be? This is what I do. And it's so ingrained that it's the removal of how they feel as though they bring value to the relationship. And the school book interventionist is saying, stop doing that. Some stranger who came in the house. And it's hard for them to hear it. In some cases where I've done intervention, what we recognize is that the enabler was so entrenched in the role, despite the rest of the family saying, Mom, Dad, don't do this, that we realized we couldn't even do an intervention on the addicted level. We had to do an intervention on them. So I started phone calls with the rest of the family and said, that person needs intervention, because there are programs for codependence. That degree of enabling is really what we start to classify as codependency, to where what starts to happen in me is not only do I want to do well for you, but in order to feel good about myself, I have to do well for you, and at the expense of myself. That's where it starts getting tricky. I start losing me to please you. That's not supposed to be what healthy love looks like. I'm supposed to keep 100% of me and have plenty to give away, and lose none of me, right? And we lose ourselves, and so that person needs a level of intervention. So what we're talking about here is the characteristics of the enabler. So here's the beautiful thing about it. It's not some like disease to be cured. It's not something that's fatal. Once you get some education, you start understanding, I haven't lost my value as a provider for my family. I still find great value and pleasure in that, and I have a whole resume of doing it. I just have to learn how I provide support this time in a way that's more specific to what this ailment is. I have to start getting my focus off of what I do and start saying there's a way I can do what I do, but in a very healthy way. When the enabler turns the corner in the interventions and says, I'm sorry, you have to go to treatment, or we cannot support this anymore, that's when the person goes. More often than not. When that person says no, it changes everything. And that person in that chair is like, okay, here's the consequences. And they say, well, I guess I'll go. And so the characteristics of the enabler is that they work for self-improvement. If I were a better parent, or my son wouldn't, or daughter wouldn't be using drugs. If I were a better wife, my husband wouldn't run around with other women. So we start to put the responsibility on ourselves for the behavior of others. So this terrible secondary statement here, if I were a better wife, my husband wouldn't turn around. Listen, I'm here to let you know. We could go to court and get all the science we need to find out that you are the lousiest spouse that ever lived. It still does not justify the behavior of your spouse. They have an obligation to come to you and say, I need more from you because I'm struggling. Not since you didn't do it, I'm going to do something even wicked, right? So their behavior is still honest and accountable to them. They are responsible for their behavior. And what the enabler believes is that they are responsible. I'm responsible for your behavior. And that's why the book says we didn't raise them this way, because families start taking the responsibility for their addicted loved one. I'm sorry, it just doesn't work that way. There's no human being who's ever been born that came into a family of complete perfection, peace, and contentment, because they're surrounded by humans. And humans have an element to us that we like to call disappointing. We can be disappointing. It's the need for God. He fills that deficit in our life and helps to empower us to become a little more ownership-oriented, a little more forgiving, a little more accepting in those areas of our life. So that child leaves the womb of its mother and comes into a world of conflict. Some go to medication as a poor coping mechanism. Some can't get out of the gymnasium. Some people become codependent. Some people become workaholics. There's thousands of bad ways to cope with the difficulties of life. Addiction is just one of them. There's never been one set of parents who have done everything right or everything wrong. So if we understand there's no perfect parents, then we also then have to ask ourselves, then why isn't everybody's child addicted if it's all just based on parenting? That's just not the way it works. It's a cocktail of reasons why a person becomes addicted. And so another thing, if you're a person of faith, what we have to also understand is no matter how well I raised my child, with the greatest techniques and methodology and hearing from the Holy Spirit, that methodology and guidance goes into a human being that has free will and can make any choice they want anytime, regardless of my advice. And so you know who also knew that and had the first set of kids who took back their will, and he was a perfect parent? God. Adam and Eve. If they can take a left turn under the perfect parenting of God, my kids might too. We got to balance this thing. Get yourself off the hook. Own what you can own, but not as the responsibility for an addiction. Here's the 3 C's. You cannot cause someone's addiction. You don't have the power to control someone's addiction. And you don't have the cure for someone's addiction. Those 3 C's belong to the person in addiction, and that's what starts to set the course for my life, is when I begin to own those 3 C's as the person in addiction. Listen, it doesn't mean that my childhood didn't seem to point to how a reason for drugs and alcohol wouldn't be understandable. I see lots of cases where it's very clear to me why you went to drugs and alcohol. I'm not confused about it at all. But I still have to own the fact that it was a poor coping mechanism. It was not the right choice. I can see how you got there. I can see how I got there. But it's still, at the end of the day, it was the wrong choice for my life. And no matter how it happened, whether I had other resources or not, I have to get to a place in my life where I own that decision as my own. And then I need to call everyone who's ever thought that they were responsible for it and immediately get them off the hook. I want you to know that, yeah, there were some difficult parts of growing up together and doing this, but I don't in any way blame you for my choice to use drugs and alcohol. That's freedom. It's freedom for everybody. And so the enabler, until they hear that, will own those 3 C's as their own to the end of their life, unless something comes along and reshapes that thinking. Changes in the environment, right? The problem is everybody else, right? So the 3-pack method of operation of every addicted person, and often addicted families, because they display some of the same behaviors, is in the face of adversity, run away, blame others, get high. Run away, blame others, get high. Run away, that's the 3-pack. And so we have to start learning even as parents in our modeling that we're not going to operate that way. And as addicted folks coming into a process of change, we have to start recognizing those really were my 3 outs to just everything that was difficult. So I'm never going to do that again. Now I'm going to burn those bridges to the ground, and I'm going to start moving forward and becoming resourceful. I'm going to get to levels of acceptance. I'm going to ask for help, and I'm going to keep moving through this adversity and grow. And I don't have to do it alone, especially if you're a person of faith. And so this runaway, blame others, and get high is what the parent are doing. It's everyone else's fault. And unfortunately, what is happening over time is that we're discovering that there's an epidemic that's much greater than addiction that's coming over our children. It's called entitlement. And it's rampant. And it's the entitlement says that I only ever deserve good things and I should never feel discomfort. Wow, man. That is going to be a tough time on earth. And so what ends up happening is when that doesn't happen for those folks, they become dysfunctional. That's tricky. And so as parents, we have to be very careful that we're not reinforcing entitlement, right? And so what happens in this is that entitlement comes into the decisions. So maybe 50 years ago when the parent got called in because the child in the school got in trouble with the principal and the parent comes into the principal's office, 50 years ago, the child was sitting in the chair waiting to hear what the trouble was going to be, and the mother was looking at the child, listening to the principal. That's changed. Now, the parent is staring at the principal and listening to the defense of the child. What are we teaching? If you have an issue with the principal and what's happened, that's fine, but you can't do it in front of the child. And so how about this one? Takes on the whole world in defense of their loved one. It's everything else is broken. It's not their fault. Everybody has a DUI. I know a pastor has a DUI, right? And we go into this gamut of justification. The pain increases because the problems are not being resolved in the life of the loved one. Much problems and a lot of emotional dysfunction we've discovered over years is actually progressive. If there's an issue of an anger in a person, it doesn't just fix itself no matter what good job you get or a really fine spouse, or that won't change your anger issue, and actually it becomes progressive over time until it's reconciled. It doesn't fix itself. It has to be addressed. So we know that even emotions can become progressive. The entire act of addiction in itself is statistically and proven to be in itself progressive. It starts small and gets larger and larger. And so if I don't reconcile it, I'm not keeping any. It's like saying you're going to keep a cub at that size in a cage. You're never going to be able to do that. Eventually you're going to have a lion that might outgrow the size of the cub's cage, right? So enabling is habit forming, or communication deteriorates, things are not being done. So now we start to see when communication breaks down, relationships break down. That's just how that happens. We have to be good and strong communicators. Enabling is a habit-forming situation. The enabler, going down in that a little bit, the enabler may get such a sense of personal satisfaction from helping that he or she does not stop to assess whether the help is helping or hurting. The rest of the family sees it, but that person doesn't because there's a degree of denial. And so this is from Henry Cloud. He's a Christian psychologist. Next slide, Bob. To rescue people from the natural consequences of their behavior is to render them powerless. It's an interesting statement, isn't it? So he's written a book called Boundaries. We actually teach this course at the men's program. Are you guys doing the ladies program too, right? Yeah. And so it's by a Reverend Good, Ron Good. And he teaches out of the book of Boundaries that Cloud and Townsend wrote. It's a great book. It's good for anybody because it's a human thing, boundaries. And he realizes that one of the boundaries that gets lost is enabling. Next slide, please. So let's use a biblical reference for enabling so that maybe we can reinforce it through faith if you're a person of faith. Maybe you're not, but this will just give you a historical biblical reference of enabling. It says, the prodigal son was an individual who went to his father and said, hey, listen, I'm of age now, I'd like my inheritance. If he went to his father that has an inheritance for him, it means his father's wealthy. And so he went to his wealthy father and he said, hey, I'd like to have my money now. I'm 16 probably in that culture, and I'm going to roll out. And I'm sure his father grabbed him and said, okay, listen, if you do good things with the money, here's what's going to happen. If you do bad things, here's what's going to happen. Because what the father understands is that's the only control and power he has over his son's life. He can't make him do anything, and he's entitled to his money. So the only power he has over his son's life is the same power you have over anybody ever. It's in my book. It's called the influence principle. That's the only power we have over anybody, including our children. We don't control anyone. We try to do our best to influence people to make good decisions and keep them from bad decisions. So he tries it, and it's unsuccessful. So his son finds himself squandering the money, spending it on all kinds of horrific things, and finds himself in a pig pit, eating all kinds of terrible things in a pig pit. And listen what it says next. And no one helped him. It doesn't say, and God was furious at the dad and told him, you better get down there and save your son. It's reflective of you. It's your fault. No. What this infers is that we all have free will, and we're not always going to do the right thing with it. And I have to sometimes let the individual experience those choices if I'm going to give them a value lesson, believing and trusting. So did his father abandon him? Certainly not. Not even in intervention do we abandon someone. When you abandon someone, what you're saying is there's nothing you can do to ever get back into my good graces. What that father was hoping is he would just simply make a choice for life, because his father can't come to the pig pit and embrace death. He could even come as far as to meet you on the bridge between life and death and get you to come back with him, the father, to life. But under no conditions as a human being can I go to you to the land of death, no matter who you are in my life. You're making a choice for death. I don't know how to embrace that. Well, because I'm a bad parent. No, because I'm not wired to do that. When I begin to embrace death, I will become death. I can't do it. You're asking me to do something that's not in my wiring unless I'm enabling and codependent. I start to turn myself over to a death style. Because people in addiction, and the son here was not in a lifestyle when he found himself in that pit. He was in a death style. Because we're either busy living or busy dying. And so this father, I'm sure, was careful and prayed for him vigorously, and probably once in a while stopped and looked down the path and hoped he would see him. And then one day he did. The son, in his own recognizance, in the reality of the pain of his consequences, he could no longer separate the squandering of the money, whatever pleasure it brought, from the consequences. And he went, ding, 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 I don't have to do this. I could be at the feasting table with my dad. I might get a cool jacket and a big pig to eat. And he did, or ram, or whatever it was, calf. And so there was a great reward to that. And his father was there and ran to him to embrace him. Amazing. This is really the story of a prodigal son leaving the love and care of their Father in heaven. This is what this is supposed to represent, our movement away from God and how we can reunite with him when we come to some conclusions. Because God is also not an enabler. In fact, God orchestrates lots of external motivation in our life to get our attention because he's a perfect parent and knows exactly how to use it. It's never mischievous or careless. It's purposeful and planned. The word says that he uses both blessings and calamity in his love for us. I know the plans I have for you, not to harm you, because I know you might be thinking that, but it's actually to give you hope in the future. Well, I'll be darned, because it did feel like harm, but it really wasn't. Oh, I see now. So next slide, please, Bob. So let's start talking about what's the difference, right? So let's look at enabling. Do it, and then we'll maybe close at this point for our break. Doing for others what they should be and are capable of doing on their own. And that doesn't even apply to people in addiction. And you can enable anybody. My brother didn't start making a first dentist appointment, I think it was like 35. My dad made all the dentist appointments for him. I don't know why he felt like he had to. I was out of the house at 16 trying to make it work. But my brother's phone calls were made for him until he was 35. So he had to make a phone call, didn't even know who to call. How do I do this? What do I say when they answer? So you can enable anybody at any age, for any reason. And so enabling says you're doing for others what they should be doing and are capable of doing on their own. Now when it goes to addiction, we go to the second part. Enabling is making decisions for that loved one that represent death. That's the difference for addiction. So what's supporting? Doing for others what they are not capable of doing for themselves. And then in addiction, that means that you're making decisions that you believe support life. So here's an example of how a decision supports death. I'm a full-blown addicted person. You know it. The whole family knows it. I've been to 4 rehabs, and I come to you and show you this big shiny thing, this brand new job. I got this great job. It's the other side of town. Would you pay for my apartment? The answer is absolutely not. That's a death-style decision. Why? Because they haven't rendered effective yet the addiction. Nothing I give you. It's the reverse Midas touch. When this is dysfunctional, everything that comes out of here and off of these will also be dysfunctional because this is the operating system. It's even the one you operate with God with. That gets cluttered, so does that get cluttered. Can I talk to God out of my knee? I have to talk to him out of the gel pack. And when that becomes cluttered, clouded, and dysfunctional, so does everything else. So the reverse Midas touch is an unhealthy person. Everything doesn't turn to gold, it turns to mold. So it doesn't matter what kind of job you get, you're going to be an addicted person on the job because you didn't do the decision for life first. First, show me a decision for life, and then I'll help you with any job I'll give you a job. I'll pay you, right? Just show me you made a decision for life. So now here's what maybe supporting looks like. Hey, I called a rehab, and they're willing to take me in, but I don't have the admissions money. Well, you're not going to give it to him, but you're going to get the phone number or her and send them the money, and you might even give them a ride because they made a decision for life. Here's another way it might be supporting. They did a 10-month, a 9-month, 12-month program in Potter's House. You're their loved one, and they say to you, hey, there's an opportunity for me to go to a recovery house. I've heard a lot of good things about it. Would you support the first month's rent, and I'll pay you back? We can even put it on paper. You can take that risk. It's your prerogative not to. You don't have to give anything to anybody ever again if you don't want to. But you could have some confidence in that because they are making a decision for life. They're continuing decisions for life. And so that's the difference. You have to evaluate if they've addressed the addiction issue. Everything beyond that, you can take a risk on and say, I want to support that. You still do it in wisdom. Who do I give the money to? Because I'm not going to put it in your hands. And so recognizing that sometimes what my enabling is I'm just doing the work for somebody that they are capable of doing on their own. But guess what they might need? Some inspiration to do it. And we find statistically that the greatest inspiration to motivate a person to do it is family. None higher. Family. And so that's basically that. How are we doing on time? Maybe we take a break right there. Let's do another, you know what, let's take our break. Let's come back at 8 o'clock. It's like 52. Take a break, get a snack, bathroom, whatever you need to do, and then we'll come back. Sound good? Because I'm going to leave some time at the end for us to also have some Q&As. Hopefully you're thinking of some things that are impactful, and whatever the case may be, feel free to bring them. See you in a bit. All right, everyone, break out your hymnal. We're going to be... No, we're not. All right. Are we ready? I look like clickety-clackety. Very nice. That's hungry folks. So here we go. So support. Look at this statement. Look what it says. You would think this would be so promising. What can you do to help? And then I say, unfortunately, not a whole lot. That's ridiculous. Everybody should just go home. Listen to what it says, though. Unfortunately, you cannot really do a whole lot to help someone who has an addiction. That person ultimately must help himself or herself. So what it's saying is there's a difference being able to try to force or manage or coerce or control somebody's decision for change, because if you had the power, believe me, you'd shake the lapels of every addicted person and say, stop doing that. Kind of you might the way with a child, they feel like being rebellious. But what this is saying is we have to be careful, because that will not fix anything, because control doesn't fix anyone. There's no real sense of control. But there is influence. And this is saying, let's start thinking a little bit more and get more creative about what can I be doing that influences good decision making and deters bad decision making. And so that's what it says. So it says, but the following may help influence their decision to get help they need for themselves. And that's the role, again, that we all play in each other's lives. We're all points of influence. Nobody makes anyone do anything. It's a funny thing, because I think where we get tripped up a little bit and we start to believe that we can make people do things, and I think to some degree we think we actually have control, is with our children. Because we think that they do what we ask them to do because we control them. You know, we don't control anybody. You say to your child on the way into the store, listen, here's the deal, and I've done it. I go in the store and say, okay, listen, Nathan, here's the deal. If we go in here, the grocery store, you understand we're going to be around other humans for a decent period of time, and you don't have a great track record with it, maybe 50-50, here's what we're going to do. If you are in here and you just stay cool and calm and stay close by my side, don't grab a bunch of stuff without asking, we'll go for ice cream. If we go in here and you start doing kind of some nutty stuff and trying to make a cereal bowl at aisle 5 with Cheerios and a thing of milk, or it's probably going to get to a point where there might be some bad stuff. Might have to take away your Xbox tonight. I might have to not let you sleep over at Billy's. So I'm giving you the opportunity to understand positive and negative reinforcement, and guess what I do after I've done that? Absolutely nothing, because there's nothing else to do. There's no more than I can do than give influence. Now we go into the store, and I'm already prepared for the fact, as a parent, that I'm not going to just get my way. I still am running a level of risk. And so if he does run to the aisle and make a cereal bowl and start screaming hysterically in the cereal, I just now have to say to myself, okay, how am I now going to respond to this? That's the control. The control is here. The control is never out here. And this is the large principle that we're teaching in the Potter's House, is what I can control and what I can't control. So I think we get fooled into believing as parents that because our child behaves, we're controlling them. Our children at any age, at any point, can take back their free will. And the problem is that when they do, we start going, I'm a lousy parent, I have a terrible child. No. You have a little human being that's making his own decisions. That's the complexity of his little gel pack or her little gel pack. And there's no guarantee on how they're going to use it. And so learning that what I'm going to have to start understanding is I have to release my tendency to believe that peace is incurred by my ability to control the situation. What I'm going to be able to start learning to control is how I'm going to appropriately respond to it and how I'm going to be proactive to try to at least create some line of preventative maintenance. And that's the role of the parent. And why we get fooled is that when the child behaves, we think somehow we magically made that happen. We influenced them. And in that time in the store with a throw of dice, they did pretty good. Then the next time comes, we can't believe it. Why would you do this? Well, because I have my own mind. And so we have to really start letting go a little bit there. So what does support look like? Next slide. So this is what it's saying we need to understand. We talked about this at the beginning. I need to have an accurate understanding of the condition. These are not people with sound minds right now. We're coming in, when I came off the streets and out of a crack house to go into a program, I was still so cloudy coming through the door of what had value, what doesn't have value. Should I keep moving forward in this? Am I even remotely going to commit to this? I don't know if I can commit to me and my hygiene, let alone. And so we're coming, these are not people that are with sound minds or lucid reasoning skills, nor are they simply secularly minded, prideful, or intentionally rebellious sinners. It's not an intentionality to operate in those behaviors. It's driven and motivated by this combination. The reason I put spiritual oppression on top, much like I said in the beginning of the training, is that's how we operate in the remedy, in the resolve. We operate from a spiritual lens down into the other domains of the person, believing that's where the empowerment comes, because that part of me, that spiritual part of me, is the part specifically connected to God. So it's the bumper car thing that sticks up, the magnetic floor and electric, keeps the bumper car moving. So if that becomes disabled, so does the activity of the bumper car. But the bumper car is still physical, right? It still has an essence of being in itself. It hasn't lost its value as a bumper car. It's still a bumper car. It may not even know it's a bumper car, but it's a bumper car. So when that disconnect happens, that line of reason and help and Holy Spirit-driven transformation is driven from a faith-based perspective through a Holy Spirit approach to the human being, believing that it is tethered to the designer. And the government's proved we're right. And so while these three things exist, the primary is operating through the spiritual, but understanding that each domain of that person is experiencing a level of oppression or deficit. And I have to be able to come into that and understand that it's more than just this being a difficult child, or they're making just independent, willful decisions for no real garnered fact or prompting. This combination is the cause and promotion of those behaviors. And we believe, again, when addressed through a spiritual lens, we start to get to the root of the disconnect that's creating those behaviors. And when we make that attachment, we find that there's great change. And so we have to understand exactly that this is a very unique set of folks that are afflicted in a different way than just simply being troublesome people, or let's get really far away from the term bad people. It's an affliction. But we know Jesus can heal all afflictions. So support also says, when we are supporting someone, we need to have an accurate understanding of the condition. Next slide, please. And the next one is, tell them and show them that you care what happens to them, right? So having conversations to understand, listen, I care. So you know the statement here, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. So that's more than just parents even. If there's someone that you're exposed to that's in addiction, remember, this is more than just for parents and DNA-connected family. It just means you have exposure to people in addiction. Well, these would be some of the techniques. Show that you have an interested, invested level of care in who they are and their value, regardless of their behavior. Because you're telling them that what you believe, which I hope you do, especially as people of faith, is that we don't believe that people's value is determined by their behavior. Unfortunately, the world does, for the most part. Christendom doesn't, and neither does Jesus. Can you imagine if our value was determined by our behavior? Right now, Jesus changed his mind. Little piles of dust, all over. Whoop, whoop, whoop. We'd all be little dust. And he would just inhale, and that'd be the end of it. And so we're not, and that's what we're teaching them, is your value is greater than this behavior. It's greater than what you're experiencing. You are not the product of the worst thing you've ever done. Come on. You are not the worst thing you've ever done. And so helping to create that separation for them starts to inspire a level of interest, because unfortunately, a lot of the response to addiction is very stigmatic. Think of all the movies with the addicted person, how they portray an addicted person, especially maybe in the last 10 years or so, we've gotten better. But in most cases, it's the most despicable person in the movie. But when we understand this is what's happening, and look what my man Henry Wadsworth Longfellow said, which I've been quoting Henry for like 20 years, and then a movie came out. Turns out everybody else likes him. Couldn't believe it. And so if we could read the secret history of our enemies, which that's not here, but the chaos that's coming out of their life, we would find in each person's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm any hostility. People don't just suddenly behave ways at a vacuum. Every moment that if I meet you tomorrow, if I meet you in 10 years, if I met you 10 years ago at that point in our life, I would have the informed version of you. I don't know what's informed you, but you will be coming informed by the days that preceded us meeting. We're a product of what we collect. And so what we're bringing into our life is going to then, at whatever point you meet me, start coming out of my life. If I learned how to do basket weaving, I'm going to start talking about it. Right? So we're all coming informed. And we're also bringing a lot of false information. We're bringing a lot of lies. We're bringing a lot of 2 + 2 = 5. By the time I got to Teen Challenge, there were 5s everywhere. And my counselor was showing me all these 5s. It took some work to move them into 4s, right? And so treat them like adults, but don't expect them to act that way. The behaviors and the emotional life has not yet been developed with a moment of clarity we're talking about today, to experience life on life's terms without the exit of disassociating from it and not feeling. What's another word for addiction? Never feel. That's what we do. We just don't feel. So I don't grow if I don't feel. But I'm still worthy of respect and dignity. I have the exact same value as every other human being on earth. So again, treat them like adults. Treat them with respect of people that have that level of potential maturity and to what's even sustained them to that day. How about treating them with the respect of the potential for what God already sees them to be, which we don't see. We don't see the final product. We have to believe for that. And so treat them like adults, but don't expect them to act that way, right? And that would be true of anybody that's had an experience to where they have not had an opportunity to grow emotionally and develop what we call emotional intelligence, which is much more valuable to human beings than intellectual intelligence. IQ, I haven't found much application for the square root of much in my life. I just haven't. I found intense application to how to treat others and how I'd like to be treated. And that's emotional intelligence, and we have to learn it. It doesn't just show up, it has to be learned. And we have to stay authentic to get the learning. Addiction is inauthenticity. So we cannot demand others to be as we wish them to be. We merely initiate the criteria and leave the choice up to the hearer. We're back to influence. I can't demand anybody to be as I'd wish them to be. Think of the complexity that comes through that when it's a child and you just want them to be as what you believe their potential is certainly evidenced before there was this hijacking or derailment of addiction, right? But the beautiful thing is that can all be reversed, and in my opinion, comes back stronger. And that's why I'm in the business I'm in, because I believe that people grow back stronger than they started. That's a biblical principle. That's the adversity principle. And that's actually what inspires me to do the work, is that I believe that the return on the investment creates something even greater. and that the addiction creates the motivation to become something greater. That's interesting. So is there a gift in there? And so, but we do have to respond to it, and that's the tricky part, because we certainly know that some folks, for whatever reason, the opportunity to respond doesn't happen, right? Which is some reason why we're meeting, because it's a critical affliction. And so ultimately, we are asking the addicted and our addicted loved ones to live up to their goals and expectations, not ours. Raise a child in the way they should go. When you study that scripture out, what it's saying is they may not at all have your interests or goals. They might not even want to be a part of the family business. Raise them up in their giftings. Raise them up in their passions. Yes, also the Word of God, which is generally where we default to in that, but it's more than that. If you study it out, you'll see it. It's saying to raise them in their interests. As long as they're righteous and godly, because that's your value system, you can support it. They don't have to have yours. Let them become what they feel the Lord is leading them to become. As long as they're pointing to chaos or sin, let them grow in it, support it, and then keep reinforcing it. So that's an important thing too, because if I go into a relationship believing that the victory is in getting them to believe that what I believe or getting them to follow my goals, I'm going to miss the mark a little bit. Some of the victory of doing this process, tell them and show them that you care what happens to them or who they are. What we're saying is that every person basically has a well that water is being added to. Good water, sometimes dirty water, right? Plenty of dirty water for people that come out of addiction at the bottom of that well. And sometimes every time they try to bring up a drink, it's dirt and debris. So when we're coming into a person's life, what we're saying is, I don't have to be the person that runs anything over. I need to be a person that's going to spend enough time to observe the well of your life, help you to see the value of the well of your life, and add good water to it every opportunity that you give me. And then I rest in my pillow knowing that that's all I could do today. And that's where my freedom and my victory comes from. Not in seeing that anybody changed, knowing that at least for that moment, I invested my time, my love, my interest, my attention to a person that's worthy of it. The degree of healthiness in that water, especially when driven by the Holy Spirit and anointed by the Holy Spirit, if you're calling on Him in those moments to give you the words, to give you the right message, man, the water that you're adding that person's life, I believe that's what we're called to do. And then we hope and pray that we're the person that happens to drop, maybe they'll drop in there, that where they turn in a tremendous corner, you see an overflow. Maybe they accept Christ as their Savior, or they make a confident and committed decision for change. It's wonderful. But you can know with great clarity that you're doing what you can do in your power by adding good water. Next slide, please. How about this? Tell them the truth in love. And so this is a ratio that the most common reference to it is Charles V, this emperor of Spain. He said, have an iron hand wrapped in a velvet glove. So what he's saying is, let's not lose the balance on how we lead people and how we influence people. He's saying you need to have an iron hand of truth that's immovable. It's not up to me, especially if it's biblical truth. It exists exclusive to me. It's iron, it's immovable, it's objective. It doesn't require my opinion. It is what it says it is. And we have to speak from absolute truth. Do you understand that the definition of truth, by definition, the reason it's called truth is because there's no other options. And when people say there's lots of truths, no, that'd be an oxymoron. There can only be one truth. That's why it's defined as the truth. And so we're saying that there's a truth that we believe in that comes from a biblical lens and perspective that we want to apply to your life in this scenario. But we want to be careful because we want to address it in a way that you feel loved, embraced, and not called out, but you feel called up. And so the velvet glove is saying, I have to also tone my approach because I want to tear down the lie in this person, but I want to hold the person up vigorously while I do it. Because I'm not tearing down the person, I'm tearing down the issue with love, or addressing the issue, or bringing clarity to the issue. And it's assertive. And so here the idea is, I'm about to have a conversation with my addicted loved one. Before you have the conversation, evaluate your ratio. What are you going to say and how are you going to say it? You should see an even blend of the two. Not too much truth to where you tore down the person, all I heard was a lesson, and not too much mush and fluff where they didn't get the point. It was a back rubbing session. It's got to be more than that. It's back rubbing and truth. Right? And so what's the ratio? For the most part in my life, that methodology is what I try to be reminded of, and I pray the Lord lays it on my heart before meetings. You know, where's my ratio? And like anyone else, we can lose balance in a ratio, and I'm certainly top of the list of having that error sometimes. But it's a great focal point to make it your method of operation, especially when dealing with the fragility of an addicted person who's very fragile and emotionally unpredictable. So the other thing we talked about earlier, next slide please, Bob, is the idea of boundaries. And this is why we teach it, because boundaries are super important. Again, you know, as a savvy listener, like if we summarized this whole training and I said to you, of everything I said, how much of it was only addiction oriented and how much of what I said was just human dynamics? Chances are you're going to get at least 50-50, because addiction is affecting human dynamics. Addiction is being remedied with spiritual dynamics because it's an error of one's ways. So there's all kinds of universals happening. Boundaries are universals. And so the best thing you can do for yourself and the individual struggling with addiction is to decide what you will and won't allow in your life. So the expression says that we teach people how to treat us by what we allow and what we disallow in our lives, right? And so that's a boundary. And they're healthy dynamics. Boundaries are not designed to keep you out. They're to keep me in on my square. Because if I don't create this boundary around myself, I'm going to come undone. And so I create, and boundaries exist in many different ways. Emotional boundaries, relational boundaries, physical boundaries. There's all kinds of boundaries we create in our life, and they're healthy. And they teach people how to treat us. And then we learn from others on how to treat them. So there's an old expression that says, and it's valuable, and it has biblical connotation, both ways I'm going to give it to you, is it says, treat others as you'd wish to be treated. How about treat others as they would wish to be treated? Right? How I want to be treated may not look at all like how you want to be treated. You may have different values, different norms. As a leader, there are certain people that they just want brief instruction to be left alone. They don't want me coming around every 5 minutes. Other people can't believe where I went. Why don't you go over here? Why'd you leave so quick? You have to treat people the way they want to be treated. And that will apply also to the differences and nuances in your children. Sometimes your parenting has to cater to the specific. We're talking about this today, Lloyd, about the unique approach that we have to each person based on who they are and their uniqueness. And I want to believe, especially under God, please, Lord, my prayer today again is help me to operate in a way in which it makes an appeal to what this person would best and how they would receive from me. So sometimes you might even use analogies. If one of the people under my care are mechanics, all of my analogies will probably be about vehicles and mechanics, right? I find the point of interest. I'm still trying to figure out ones for design and to being a designer, Julie. I got to get that feminine side, I don't know, something. But while the line might be different depending on your particular situation, err on the side of caution. It's important to protect your own emotional and mental health as well as that of the dependent family members from the tremendous amount of damage that active addiction can cause. I really should say addiction, not addicts. I don't like that word. Remember, the person that you used to trust has changed to untrustworthy, even if only temporary. So it doesn't mean that they're stuck to be untrustworthy, but the person is only untrustworthy because what's driving the individual creates behaviors that take away the primary ingredient for relationships: safety. No safety, no relationship. And so when families are saying, hey, Joel, we'd like you to come and do an intervention, and I would say to them, if I was to say to them, why? And they'd say, well, my son or daughter's in addiction. I'd say, well, why do you want me to come? And they'd say, because we don't want them to die. Okay, that's good reason. Or we want them to live out their full potential. But what really caused them to call me is what was destroyed or strained was what addiction does best, is it assassinates trust. And that's why it's so divisive and why it's so effective. And so when you say to an addicted loved one, would you agree that to be in a healthy relationship, we have to have trust? They would say yes, and I'd say, well, I don't care if you call yourself an addict or not, or addicted or not, this behavior does not create trust. Your family is saying, would you take this step to reestablish trust? And wouldn't you like to have that? I don't need a person to tell me they're addicted or not. I can tell you that your behavior is destroying relationships, because that's why we're here on earth. So I don't care what the point of entry is to get you to start working on your behavior. Whether it's you just want trust back, I don't care what the incentive is for anybody to come to our program. I'm here because the court said so, whatever. Spend some time in the process and let's see what can grow out of what got you here. And so remember that person it says that you used to trust has changed. And that's what addiction does do, because it affects the method of operation. The operating system of a human being is their sense of reason, right? And how we deal with each other. Well, when this thing also has a neurobiological effect, it changes a person's ability to reason well. And so we're dealing with that. So we have to understand that in the approach, that things have changed, but it doesn't mean they cannot be made better or better than when we started. And that's what keeps us motivated. Next slide, please. And then, of course, the whole theme of this, support means avoiding enabling. We talked about this earlier. That's the primary thing, but that goes under the category of how I know I'm supporting, because I'm not doing that. And so a good understanding of that is going to keep me free of it. Next slide. So here are the enabling questions, right? The help you've been giving, is it actually helping? So I sit with a family in intervention, they list all these things they've been doing, but we're still meeting. How long have you been doing those things? Oh, Lord, they look at each other and we come up with numbers like 5, 10 years. So obviously that's not working. And so we need to be thinking of different. We'll talk a little bit more of that at the end. So is your loved one changing based on that methodology? No. So there's some things in there that are not motivating change. No matter how much you believe what you're doing should, it's not. And so we're going to have to start thinking a little counterintuitively. The book of Ecclesiastes says that there's a time to embrace and there's a time to refrain from embracing. Everyone hates that second part, especially when it comes to people in addiction. You mean I have to let go a little. Ew. No, I want to grab on tighter. I want to love them to death. And so look at their actions. Is there clear evidence of your loved one becoming a responsible and godly person, especially if that's your interest in that they would? Or is your loved one continuing down a path to destruction? So how to make chocolate cake. So what I mean by that is, if you would like to have chocolate cake come out of your oven, and I think of myself in addiction as well, but every time I go to my oven and I look for my chocolate cake, it's vanilla. The only way I'm ever going to get chocolate cake to come out of that oven is if I change the ingredients. I cannot keep using vanilla cake ingredients and expect to get chocolate cake. So when you come to families, when I come to you about issues of enabling and what creates change there, what I'm asking you to do is consider your recipe. So this might have been actually a baking class, this whole thing, if you really boil it down. Because what this whole training is saying is investigate your ingredients and your methodology. What's your recipe for what you want? Maybe we need to start thinking about taking a risk and incorporating some recipe and some ingredients that might just take a chance of making change. So some of the opposite of enabling is coming to creating some boundaries. I talked to a woman earlier that told me it got to a place, and she's right, that the individual was so in the throes of the behavior in their home that it made the home unlivable. And they had to make the decision to say, listen, unless you get help, you cannot bring this into my home. And so this is where it gets challenging. So intuitively, that seems like the last thing you should ever do. But there's a part of this that is also the responsibility that I have to myself. So when I do an intervention, what I'm saying to the family is you have equal value to your loved one, especially if you're a person of faith. You have a specific and exclusive relationship with your Father in heaven, because before we're anybody's parent, we're first somebody's son and daughter. That has to be the entry point for everything I do. I cannot lose myself to the willful decisions of another human being, regardless of the dynamics, without abandoning my relationship of effectiveness with them. Because the addiction and the codependency enabling renders me ineffective. I start to come into the same behaviors and breakdown as addiction. I can't do that. I have to stay true to the call of my life as a child of God. And I have to start operating in the duty of love and start making decisions where I may not be able to have emotional satisfaction. But sometimes what we find out is when we act in the duty of love, the thing that comes running after the duty is the emotions that jump right into the back of your heart and confirm that your duty was correct. And that's the risk we take, is that maybe I can be emotionally confirmed if I make a duty-based love decision. And so we talk about things like an intervention and getting involved in those things. Next slide, please. And so these are similar, but they talk to practicality. Have you ever made an excuse for someone, be it for work, school, or anything like that? Do you accept responsibility for their behavior? Do you avoid the subject in fear of some type of confrontation or some kind of response? So what I do as the addicted person is I teach you to leave me alone by how I respond to when you address me. So maybe I start to engender the guilt and get you to believe you're responsible for my addiction. If you didn't let that happen and let that happen, you caused my addiction. So that keeps you at bay. It's a manipulation tactic. Or when you approach me, I just become volatile and angry and puff up and break things. Well, what do you think is going to happen? You think you're going to still come to me when I break things? What I've taught you is when you come to me, I get violent. Who wants to be around that? So guess what happens? You stop coming to me. And so the behavior starts to teach us how we should be behaving to the addiction, and ultimately addiction wins until it doesn't. And we say, no, we're going to have to go to a different line of intervention. One way is we have to do it is we have to stop coming to the individual who's addicted individually. We have to create what's called a board of directors. And families, so this is an actual practical tip, comes out of intervention training. I paid $5,000 to get this piece of information. You're getting it for free. And so that's just Jesus right there. And so what you have to do as a family is you have to create a board of directors to where the family comes together. And what it is it's many messages but one voice. What the board of directors and family, that doesn't have to be just family, it could be a high school gym teacher, it could be the pastor of the church, it could be their employer, people that are willing to be a part of the team. And then what you do, what the agreement you make, the primary agreement before you even take any more action to motivating change, is you all agree that never again will anybody here ever make an individual decision in response to the addicted loved one. Any requests that come to you, you call the whole team on a WhatsApp and say, he or she just asked me for this, what does everybody think? And then when they come to you and say, hey, can I get $20? Your response is, everybody wants $20, by the way. It's always about $20. And so when they come to you asking you for $20, because they're out of gas money, I got to pay for Junior's soccer camp. No. And so it's always about $20. And so when they come to you, your response to them before even sending the family is, hey, I'll consult the family and we'll let you know. That's weird. Consult the family? Yeah, we're not doing this alone anymore. And what you break down immediately then is their ability to triangulate and manipulate people individually and whack stories out. Nothing lines up. Do you know what Billy said about you? And then I chase after Billy and now I just, okay, that might work, right? And so it breaks down triangulation because the person in addiction is trying to survive the addiction. In other words, keep the addiction alive. Not intentionally, really. It's an odd thing. What will I be without it? And so they protect it. And so the way they protect it is that, well, that's just the way we protect it. I've lived it for years. Is the way that it's protected is by making sure that there's nobody coming to me with a plan of action. If you want to argue with me and tell me how upset you are that I do that in your house, and you yell through the bedroom door and tell me how bad my behavior is, and when are you going to learn? Wait till your father comes home, and then he just comes up and has a good talk, Dad, but never made any demands for change, my addiction is great with that. I will do that until we all pass away. The veracity of my addiction will out-argue you until the day of your last breath. You will never argue me into getting anywhere, ever. Not one protest, not one act of dismay or displeasure is going to motivate me. What's going to motivate me is when you start saying to me in whatever form it comes for you, is we are no longer going to allow this, and then you do it. That's when the bells and whistles go off for the addicted person. The addiction is going crazy. They're taking action. And then that's when the triangulation starts. Mom's kicking me out. They go, the older brother wants to rescue his younger brother because he feels obligated because he's the older brother. You're supposed to rescue your younger brother. Right? All those dynamics come into play, and the addicted person knows all the dynamics of who to appeal to. There's hard and there's soft targets in every family. Most times, Dad's a hard target. Not all the time, but most times, he's going to tell me to get a job. I'm not going to be able to work him for anything, but Mom, or the other, or my younger sister, they're soft targets. I can go to them and get some money. I can work their guilt for me. I can show them how I'm being oppressed by Mom and Dad. Remember that time they said that to you? They're saying that to me now. Can you believe these two? How are they even parents? And my little sister goes, yeah, that's ridiculous. But are you okay? Yeah, I'm fine. They make it much worse than it is, and I get $20. But so what I learned as the addicted person is who are the hard targets and who are the soft targets. When you align as a board of directors, the idea is there's no hard or soft targets. They're all reason and truth. And so that's the nugget of being a board of directors for your addicted loved one. It'll change everything. Then the board of directors has to start making decisions on creating boundaries. What are we going to start disallowing? No more money, no more nothing. Can that person even continue to live in your home? If not, we support that. We'll come help him move. And when you tell him, we'll be there in the kitchen with you to let him know. So it's not kicking him out. You're never making any of those decisions without an option. Listen, if you don't go to treatment today, and we start working on phone calls now to get you somewhere, unfortunately, this is the day and you can't be here. So they have the option to make a choice for life because they're making choices for death, and you can't embrace it. And so this is really what a lot of this starts to look like. And then the other ones that we said earlier, are we bailing him or her out of jail, bad situations? Do we pay their bills? Do we loan money or pay bills, whether you have it or not, at your own expense, knowing, I don't know where this is going? How many last chances have we given? One more time, and there's just an endless stream of one more time conversations, because it's hard emotionally to make a decision sometimes that big. And that's why it has to start coming to a place greater than emotion, and it has to start becoming an act of duty to that person. The Bible says there's no greater act of love than when one lays his life down for another or a brother. So in other words, when you do that, do you think that the person is doing that because they believe emotionally it's a good thing to do? That may be in there. They're doing it out of an act of duty. Anything I do at the expense of myself for you isn't because I'm emotionally attached to feeling a level of expense. It's because I see it as an obligation or a commitment to a relationship, and I'm willing to experience that sacrifice. When a soldier jumps on a grenade, he's not emotionally attached to jumping on the grenade. It's an act of love, and it's an act of duty. Jesus was not emotionally attached to being on the cross. He said, hey, listen, God, I really don't want to do this. But if it's your will and an act of love and duty because of who you are and who I am to you, I will do it. That's the duty of love. We have the Holy Spirit of Christ in our lives. We have the power to have the duty of love. And so, have you threatened to leave or kick him or her out but never do? Do you find yourself completing their responsibilities? May your choices reflect your hopes, not your fears. So in other words, are the choices that we're making out of a addicted loved one all choices of consequence, what will happen, scenarios of what if, and all our choices are being generated out of fear and what if? My gosh, we can't live in the land of what if. There's no residency for me in the land of what if. There's all kinds of residency for me in the land of what is. And I've got to get to a level of acceptance and start taking action in what is, not the land of what if. There's no land of what if for anybody in here, and the Bible speaks to that. We stay in the now, we trust God with the future. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep people warm. Right? Once the enabling stops, the recovery is given an opportunity to start. That might be the last slide. No. Support. This is number 6 to support, is where do I get the support, right? And so we see all the different places. So Al-Anon I put first because it's probably one of the most available. It has a very universal feel to it. It's not by nature designed to be a Christian faith-based program, but all of the principles of Al-Anon, like the 12 steps of recovery, are all birthed from biblical principle and then converted to have a much more universal feel and the absence of scripture. I'll put the scripture in. When they say the principles of Al-Anon, I can return every one of them to a biblical scripture. There's not one I've heard yet, ever in those rooms, that wasn't antithetical to biblical belief system. And so while they might say higher power in that room, put in Jesus in your mind. They just said Jesus. Because that room is effective because it's not for the addicted person. It's for the families of addicted loved ones. So that you can be in a like-minded environment without the possible coercion of that addicted loved one's defense when you start speaking your heart. You can do it without any distraction, and you can be with people that are also experiencing that issue. So families struggle sometimes to want to get involved with that kind of activity because they feel as though it puts them out there and it's uncomfortable and they don't want to do it. And so families generally are saying to a loved one, listen, I know you don't want to go to rehabilitation, because nobody's ever wanted to go to rehabilitation. Nobody wants a root canal, nobody wants dialysis, and nobody wants chemotherapy. If you're going, it's because there's a pre-existing condition that leaves no choice, and it's called pain and discomfort. Nobody desires to go to rehab and never has, but are willing to go because of necessity. That's who goes. So the loved one is saying, I know you don't want to go, but we need you to go. Make a duty-based decision. If you're waiting on a bus to come with an emotion that says why you'll love it there, it probably is not going to come. But we need you to go, and the loved one finally says, okay, I'll go. Well, for me, if you have an addicted loved one, that's what I'm now saying to you. I don't need you to want to go to Al-Anon. I'm saying you need to go. Your legs are going to have to take you. But if you're waiting for a bus emotionally to get you into a room full of strangers to talk about the most deep difficulties of your life, there's no emotional bus that's going to take you there. You're going to have to go out of an act of duty and faith and trust that once you get there, you'll know you're home. Make one comment at an Al-Anon meeting and you'll know you're home, because you're going to see all the heads going. And other people are going to piggyback immediately. And you'll know you may not find it in the first one. Go to 3 or 4 of them and find the one that you know is your home. It's a recommendation that I'm giving you in the way a doctor would recommend a medicine. And so there's Codependent Anonymous, Celebrate Recovery, NA-Anon, which is like Al-Anon. The same principles, different drugs of choice. And of course, church and spiritual advisor and pastoral counseling and sharing, confessing your issues one to another, and private counseling and treatment programs. And then last slide, we're done. And so I want to leave a little time for questions and answers if you have. I know we're a little bit over. So these are some books that are notoriously great books for understanding and getting a feel for what addiction looks like. Most of these come out of family experiences, which I love. Melanie Beatty is the guru of codependency. She wrote a book called Codependent No More. She has most recent versions. She seems to put out a new version about every 4 or 5 years. But if you feel like maybe we've identified some codependency, great. So now we can at least say, be inspired to maybe address it, because it doesn't make you a bad person if you're codependent. It just means, hey, this is something that taxes me. Read this book. I think you'll find great relief from this book. It's a bestseller. And the other books we talked about to some degree, Boundaries. Lost Years is a woman named Kim Wonsiak, who was an alcoholic in her family and drove her family crazy, and eventually became an interventionist and was on television for years. I don't know if you ever saw her, but. So these are great books, and of course my books in the back. Rob's books are still back there too for inspiration. There's a testimony that speaks to everything I said about getting free. And so that's it. Any questions and answers in the last couple minutes? If you have to go, please feel free to go. I understand it, we're ran a little over. But if there's anything that we can talk about, please feel free to do it. Anything raised up? If not, we'll certainly meet you in the back there for a little bit. If you have maybe raised up a private conversation. Yes? Please.
Addiction is to keep you from feeling, usually.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard it in the reverse? I do these things because I don't feel anything, I want to feel something.
Wow, that's interesting. Well, I would say what's happening there is now we're really talking about, probably under those categories of the 3, we're probably talking about spiritual oppression. Because one of the signatures of spiritual oppression is I'm losing a sense of hope and personhood. So in other words, I'm falling into a place of fusion with the drug use where I'm more identified in my inauthenticity than I am in my authenticity. So for a period of time, I'm trying to add drugs and alcohol or my addiction to everyday living. And there I'm still feeling. And eventually what happens is I get so in the throes of addiction that I'm trying to add periods of life to the habits of my addiction. So when that transfer begins to happen, there's absolutely going to be a numbing of that person, and what we're really describing is a deep place of denial and delusion. I'm staying behind the veil of the addiction. And so that person, when they say, I want to feel, they're not saying they want to feel, they're saying, I only want to feel good because I usually feel really bad. Because when you get high, the only thing you feel is good. You don't suddenly have a need to go rescue people in India, right? You're only there to feel independently free from whatever was not feeling good. And so it's really got to reframe the statement a bit.
So it's basically the same thing, just
reversed, ultimately. Because that person is feeling something. If I am feeling the absence of feeling, that's what I'm feeling. You're never not feeling. So what you're trying, so the reason for the addiction is when I don't have to process with reason how I feel, I can abandon it in the disassociation in my brain. Then I come back and I feel it all over again, and guess what that makes me want to do? Go back out again. And if I did all kinds of adversive behaviors to get that high, when I come back this time, it's worse than before. All the lies I have to cover. And you go back. Oh my God, I stole money from my grandmother. And you go back. So there's always a place of feeling outside of getting high. That's why you get high. You don't want to feel it. Make sense? Anybody else? Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, Joel, thank you so much for sharing about
My pleasure.
living in codependency.
Yeah.
Why is it so hard for a person, everyone knows that the addicted person is sick, they need help.
Yeah.
And why is it so hard for the people that are affected by that? Why can't, they think that I'm okay,
Yeah.
it's not my problem.
Right.
So, you know, they're sick, I'm not. I've
Right.
I'm towing the line, doing the duty and everything.
Right.
So that creates a form of denial, doesn't it?
That's where I was going to go. It is
Yeah.
denial. You know, I have the option, as you have the option, meaning all of us, in any moment of adversity to make a series of decisions on how I respond to it. I can, remember what we said earlier, the life of an addicted person is run away, blame others, and get high in the face of adversity. But you understand that's also common to human beings that have not got to a place of maybe emotional stability, dealt with the old root issues of their own life. Maybe it's a familiar pattern that for some reason, to some degree, was reinforced as effective. So I keep using it. If I'm a child and I run away from my issues, and I abandon the difficulty of being home, guess what that tells me? That's effective. When I start getting high and I don't feel my pain anymore, guess what it tells me? That's effective methodology. So it's learned helplessness, it's learned behavior. And so that person in that moment has a choice to make in the same way we do. In the face of adversity, you have several options on what you're going to do with that. You can just totally dismiss it and say, not my problem. You can do it with anything, even if it is your problem. It's not my problem, right? Because you evaluate only yourself as an individual in a vacuum in the world. And unfortunately, everything that is my problem by default is everybody's problem that loves me on some degree because it's affecting them. Nothing I'm ever going to do the rest of my life, if I come into my workplace in a miserable mood, I'm not in a miserable mood, I'm bringing a miserable mood to everyone else in my workplace. And so there's no such thing as complete abandonment unless you're going to go on an island somewhere, and then everybody who loves you is going to be worried. Why are they not? So you're still affecting them on the island. You can go to Mars. Why won't he come back from Mars? And when we're in this process of recovery, Rob, that speaks to a very good point about what healing and recovery looks like, is it's the realization and the ownership and the joy of knowing that every choice I make in my life, good, bad, silly, or indifferent, is going to have an effect on the people around me. And you know what? I want to take ownership for that because the entire value of my life is relationships. There's misery in absolute freedom. I put you on an island with no humans. There's shows. There's a show called Alone. And the people that even are great survivalists, they're all alone. They can't leave until the last person drops. They don't even know who it is. They won't know if they won. They're all in their own separate place. And what you find in that is the breakdown for all of them, more interestingly, 80% men and only about 20% women. But the men, especially, start breaking down emotionally. They can survive. They have 25 fish. They can be out there another 50 days. But they're crying like infants because they miss their children and the things they love. They have everything they need in their basic needs and the promise of staying to get $500,000, and they're still tapping because the independence represented pain, as does the independence of addiction. You end up in a lonely, painful place in the attempt to be free of pain. That's what happens.